Book 2, Chapter 12 of Armadale by Wilkie Collins. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dawn. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book 2, Chapter 12. The Clouding of the Sky. 9 days had passed, and the 10th day was nearly at an end since Miss Gwilt and her pupil had taken their morning walk in the cottage garden. The night was overcast. Since sunset there had been signs in the sky from which the popular forecast had predicted rain. The reception rooms at the great house were all empty and dark. Allan was away, passing the evening with the Milroys, and Midwinter was waiting his return. Not where Midwinter usually waited, among the books in the library, but in the little back room which Allan's mother had inhabited in the last days of her residence at Thorpe Ambrose. Nothing had been taken away, but much had been added to the room since Midwinter had first seen it. The books which Mrs. Armadale had left behind her, the furniture, the old matting on the floor, the old paper on the walls, were all undisturbed. The statuette of Niobe still stood on its bracket, and the French window still opened on the garden. But now, to the relics left by the mother, were added the personal possessions belonging to the son. The wall, bare hitherto, was decorated with water-colorings, with a portrait of Mrs. Armadale supported on one side by a view of the old house in Somersetshire, and on the other by a picture of the yacht. Among the books which bore in faded ink Mrs. Armadale's inscriptions, "From my father," were other books inscribed in the same handwriting, in brighter ink, "To my son." Hanging to the wall, ranged on the chimney-piece, scattered over the table, were a host of little objects, some associated with Allan's past life, others necessary to his daily pleasures and pursuits, and all plainly testifying that the room which he habitually occupied at Thorpe Ambrose was the very room which had once recalled to Midwinter the second vision of the dream. Here, strangely unmoved by the scene around him, so lately the object of his superstitious distrust, Allan's friend now waited composedly for Allan's return; and here, more strangely still, he looked on a change in the household arrangements, due, in the first instance, entirely to himself. His own lips had revealed the discovery which he had made on the first morning in the new house. His own voluntary act had induced the son to establish himself in the mother's room. Under what motives had he spoken the words? Under no motives which were not natural growth of the new interests and the new hopes that now animated him. The entire change wrought in his convictions by the memorable event that had brought him face to face with Miss Gwilt was a change which it was not in his nature to hide from Allan's knowledge. He had spoken openly, and had spoken as it was in his character to speak. The merit of conquering his superstition was a merit which he shrank from claiming, until he had first unsparingly exposed that superstition in its worst and weakest aspects to view. It was only after he had unreservedly acknowledged the impulse under which he had left Allan at the Mere that he had taken credit to himself for the new point of view from which he could now look at the dream. Then, and not till then, he had spoken of the fulfillment of the first vision as the doctor at the Isle of Man might have spoken of it. He had asked, as the doctor might have asked, where was the wonder of their seeing a pool at sunset, when they had a whole network of pools within a few hours' drive of them? And what was there extraordinary in discovering a woman at the Mere, when there were roads that led to it, and villages in its neighborhood, and boats employed on it, and pleasure parties visiting it? So again he had waited to vindicate the firmer resolution with which he looked to the future, until he had first revealed all that he now saw himself of the errors of the past, the abandonment of his friend's interests, the unworthiness of the confidence that had given him the steward's place, the forgetfulness of the trust that Mr. Brock had reposed in him, all implied the one idea of leaving Allan, were all pointed out. The glaring self-contradictions betrayed in accepting the dream as the revelation of a fatality, and in attempting to escape that fatality by exertion of free will, in toiling to store up knowledge of the steward's duties for the future, and in shrinking from letting the future find him in Allan's house, were, in their turn, unsparingly exposed to every error, to every inconsistency. He resolutely confessed, before he ventured on the last simple appeal which closed all. Will you trust me in the future? Will you forgive and forget the past? A man who could thus open his whole heart, without one lurking reserve inspired by consideration for himself, was not a man to forget any minor act of concealment of which his weakness might have led him to be guilty toward his friend. It lay heavy on Midwinter's conscience that he had kept secret from Allan a discovery which he ought, in Allan's dearest interests, to have revealed, the discovery of his mother's room. But one doubt still closed his lips, the doubt whether Mrs. Armadale's conduct in Madeira had been kept secret on her return to England. Careful inquiry, first among the servants, then among the tenantry, careful consideration of the few reports current at the time, as repeated to him by the few persons left who remembered them, convinced him at last that the family secret had been successfully kept within the family limits. Once satisfied that whatever inquiries the son might make would lead to no disclosure which could shake his respect for his mother's memory, Midwinter had hesitated no longer. He had taken Allan into the room, and had shown him the books on the shelves, and all that the writing in the books had disclosed. He had said plainly, "My one motive for not telling you this before sprang from my dread of interesting you in the room which I looked at with horror as the second of the scenes pointed at in the dream. Forgive me this also, and you will have forgiven me all." With Allan's love for his mother's memory, but one result could follow such an avowal as this. He had liked the little room from the first, as a pleasant contrast to the oppressive grandeur of the other rooms at Thorpe Ambrose. And now that he knew what associations were connected with it, his resolution was at once taken to make it especially his own. The same day all his personal possessions were collected and arranged in his mother's room, in Midwinter's presence, and with Midwinter's assistance given to the work. Under those circumstances had the change now wrought in the household arrangements been produced, and in this way had Midwinter's victory over his own fatalism, by making Allan the daily occupant of a room which he might otherwise hardly ever have entered, actually favored the fulfillment of the second vision of the dream. The hour wore on quietly as Allan's friend sat waiting for Allan's return. Sometimes reading, sometimes thinking placidly, he whiled away the time. No vexing cares, no boding doubts troubled him now. The rent day, which he had once dreaded, had come and gone harmlessly. A friendlier understanding had been established between Allan and his tenants. Mr. Bashwood had proved himself to be worthy of the confidence reposed in him. The Pedgifts, father and son, had amply justified their client's good opinion of them. Wherever Midwinter looked, the prospect was bright, the future was without a cloud. He trimmed the lamp on the table beside him, and looked out at the night. The stable clock was chiming the half-hour past 11 as he walked to the window, and the first raindrops were beginning to fall. He had his hand on the bell to summon the servant and send him over to the cottage with an umbrella, when he was stopped by hearing the familiar footstep on the walk outside. "How late you are!" said Midwinter, as Allan entered through the open French window. "Was there a party at the cottage?" "No, only ourselves. The time slipped away somehow," he answered in lower tones than usual, and sighed as he took his chair. "You seem to be out of spirits," pursued Midwinter. "What's the matter?" Allan hesitated. "I may as well tell you," he said, after a moment. "It's nothing to be ashamed of. I only wonder you haven't noticed it before. There's a woman in it, as usual. I'm in love." Midwinter laughed. "Has Miss Milroy been more charming to-night than ever?" he asked, gayly. "Miss Milroy!" repeated Allan. "What are you thinking of? I'm not in love with Miss Milroy." "Who is it, then?" "Who is it? What a question to ask! Who can it be but Miss Gwilt?" There was a sudden silence. Allan sat listlessly, with his hands in his pockets, looking out through the open window at the falling rain. If he had turned toward his friend when he mentioned Miss Gwilt's name, he might possibly have been a little startled by the change he would have seen in Midwinter's face. I suppose you don't approve of it," he said, after waiting a little. There was no answer. "It's too late to make objections," proceeded Allan. "I really mean it when I tell you I'm in love with her." "A fortnight since you were in love with Miss Milroy," said the other, in quiet, measured tones. "Pooh! A mere flirtation. It's different this time. I'm in earnest about Miss Gwilt." He looked round as he spoke. Midwinter turned his face aside on the instant, and bent it over a book. "I see you don't approve of the thing," Allan went on. "Do you object to her being only a governess? You can't do that, I'm sure. If you were in my place, her being only a governess wouldn't stand in the way with you." "No," said Midwinter, "I can't honestly say it would stand in the way with me." He gave the answer reluctantly, and pushed his chair back out of the light of the lamp. "A governess is a lady who is not rich," said Allan, in an oracular manner, "and a duchess is a lady who is not poor. And that's all the difference I acknowledge between them. Miss Gwilt is older than I am. I don't deny that. What age do you guess her at, Midwinter? I say 7 or 8 and 20. What do you say?" "Nothing. I agree with you." "Do you think 7 or 8 and 20 is too old for me? If you were in love with a woman yourself, you wouldn't think 7 or 8 and 20 too old, would you?" "I can't say I should think it too old, if you were really fond of her?" Once more there was no answer. "Well, if there's no harm in her being only a governess, and no harm in her being a little older than I am, what's the objection to Miss Gwilt?" "I have made no objection." "I don't say you have, but you don't seem to like the notion of it, for all that." There was another pause. Midwinter was the first to break the silence this time. "Are you sure of yourself, Allan?" he asked, with his face bent once more over the book. "Are you really attached to this lady? Have you thought seriously already of asking her to be your wife?" "I am thinking seriously of it at this moment," said Allan. "I can't be happy. I can't live without her. Upon my soul, I worship the very ground she treads on." "How long—" His voice faltered, and he stopped. "How long," he reiterated, "have you worshipped the very ground she treads on?" "Longer than you think for. I know I can trust you with all my secrets." "Don't trust me!" "Nonsense! I will trust you. There is a little difficulty in the way which I haven't mentioned yet. It's a matter of some delicacy, and I want to consult you about it. Between ourselves, I have had private opportunities with Miss Gwilt." Midwinter suddenly started to his feet, and opened the door. "We'll talk of this to-morrow," he said. "Good night." Allan looked round in astonishment. The door was closed again, and he was alone in the room. "He has never shaken hands with me!" exclaimed Allan. As the words passed his lips, the door opened again, and Midwinter appeared. "We haven't shaken hands," he said abruptly. "God bless you, Allan. We'll talk of it to-morrow. Good night." Allan stood alone at the window, looking out at the pouring rain. He felt ill at ease, without knowing why. "Midwinter's ways get stranger and stranger," he thought. "What can he mean by putting me off till to-morrow, when I wanted to speak to him to-night?" He took up his bedroom candle a little impatiently, put it down again, and, walking back to the open window, stood looking out in the direction of the cottage. "I wonder if she's thinking of me," he said to himself softly. She was thinking of him. She had just opened her desk to write to Mrs. Oldershaw, and her pen had that moment traced the opening line: "Make your mind easy. I have got him." End of Book 2, Chapter 12, Armadale, by Wilkie Collins. Recording by Dawn.
Book the Second, Chapter 13 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. 13. Exit. It rained all through the night, and when the morning came it was raining still. Contrary to his ordinary habit, Midwinter was waiting in the breakfast-room when Allan entered it. He looked worn and weary, but his smile was gentler and his manner more composed than usual. To Allan's surprise, he approached the subject of the previous night's conversation of his own accord as soon as the servant was out of the room. "I am afraid you thought me very impatient and very abrupt with you last night," he said. "I will try to make amends for it this morning. I will hear everything you wish to say to me on the subject of Miss Gwilt." "I hardly like to worry you," said Allan. "You look as if you had had a bad night's rest." "I have not slept well for some time past," replied Midwinter, quietly. "Something has been wrong with me. But I believe I have found out the way to put myself right again without troubling the doctors. Late in the morning I shall have something to say to you about this. Let us get back first to what you were talking of last night. You were speaking of some difficulty—" He hesitated, and finished the sentence in a tone so low that Allan failed to hear him. "Perhaps it would be better," he went on, "if, instead of speaking to me, you spoke to Mr. Brock?" "I would rather speak to you," said Allan. "But tell me first, was I right or wrong last night in thinking you disapproved of my falling in love with Miss Gwilt?" Midwinter's lean, nervous fingers began to crumble the bread in his plate. His eyes looked away from Allan for the first time. "If you have any objection," persisted Allan, "I should like to hear it." Midwinter suddenly looked up again, his cheeks turning ashy pale, and his glittering black eyes fixed full on Allan's face. "You love her," he said. "Does she love you?" "You won't think me vain?" returned Allan. "I told you yesterday I had had private opportunities with her." Midwinter's eyes dropped again to the crumbs on his plate. "I understand," he interposed, quickly. "You were wrong last night. I had no objections to make." "Don't you congratulate me?" asked Allan, a little uneasily. "Such a beautiful woman! Such a clever woman!" Midwinter held out his hand. "I owe you more than mere congratulations," he said. "In anything which is for your happiness I owe you help." He took Allan's hand, and wrung it hard. "Can I help you?" he asked, growing paler and paler as he spoke. "My dear fellow," exclaimed Allan, "what is the matter with you? Your hand is as cold as ice." Midwinter smiled faintly. "I am always in extremes," he said. "My hand was as hot as fire the first time you took it at the old West Country Inn. Come to that difficulty which you have not come to yet. You are young, rich, your own master, and she loves you. What difficulty can there be?" Allan hesitated. "I hardly know how to put it," he replied. "As you said just now, I love her, and she loves me. And yet there is a sort of strangeness between us. One talks a good deal about oneself when one is in love, at least I do. I've told her all about myself and my mother, and how I came in for this place, and the rest of it. Well, though it doesn't strike me when we are together, it comes across me now and then, when I'm away from her, that she doesn't say much on her side. In fact, I know no more about her than you do." "Do you mean that you know nothing about Miss Gwilt's family and friends?" "That's it, exactly." "Have you never asked her about them?" "I said something of the sort the other day," returned Allan, "and I'm afraid, as usual, I said it in the wrong way. She looked, I can't quite tell you how, not exactly displeased, but oh, what things words are! I'd give the world, Midwinter, if I could only find the right word when I want it as well as you do." "Did Miss Gwilt say anything to you in the way of a reply?" "That's just what I was coming to. She said, 'I shall have a melancholy story to tell you one of these days, Mr. Armadale, about myself and my family; but you look so happy, and the circumstances are so distressing, that I have hardly the heart to speak of it now.' Ah, she can express herself, with the tears in her eyes, my dear fellow, with the tears in her eyes. Of course I changed the subject directly; and now the difficulty is how to get back to it, delicately, without making her cry again. We must get back to it, you know; not on my account, I am quite content to marry her first and hear of her family misfortunes, poor thing, afterward. But I know Mr. Brock. If I can't satisfy him about her family when I write to tell him of this, which, of course, I must do, he will be dead against the whole thing. I'm my own master, of course, and I can do as I like about it. But dear old Brock was such a good friend to my poor mother, and he has been such a good friend to me. You see what I mean, don't you?" "Certainly, Allan. Mr. Brock has been your second father. Any disagreement between you about such a serious matter as this would be the saddest thing that could happen. You ought to satisfy him that Miss Gwilt is, what I am sure Miss Gwilt will prove to be, worthy, in every way worthy." His voice sank in spite of him, and he left the sentence unfinished. "Just my feeling in the matter," Allan struck in, glibly. "Now we can come to what I particularly wanted to consult you about. If this was your case, Midwinter, you would be able to say the right words to her. You would put it delicately, even though you were putting it quite in the dark. I can't do that. I'm a blundering sort of fellow, and I'm horribly afraid, if I can't get some hint at the truth to help me at starting, of saying something to distress her. Family misfortunes are such tender subjects to touch on, especially with such a refined woman, such a tender-hearted woman as Miss Gwilt. There may have been some dreadful death in the family, some relation who has disgraced himself, some infernal cruelty which has forced the poor thing out on the world as a governess. Well, turning it over in my mind, it struck me that the major might be able to put me on the right track. It is quite possible that he might have been informed of Miss Gwilt's family circumstances before he engaged her, isn't it?" "It is possible, Allan, certainly." "Just my feeling again. My notion is to speak to the major. If I could only get the story from him first, I should know so much better how to speak to Miss Gwilt about it afterward. You advise me to try the major, don't you?" There was a pause before Midwinter replied. When he did answer, it was a little reluctantly. "I hardly know how to advise you, Allan," he said. "This is a very delicate matter." "I believe you would try the major if you were in my place," returned Allan, reverting to his inveterately personal way of putting the question. "Perhaps I might," said Midwinter, more and more unwillingly. "But if I did speak to the major, I should be very careful, in your place, not to put myself in a false position. I should be very careful to let no one suspect me of the meanness of prying into a woman's secrets behind her back." Allan's face flushed. "Good heavens, Midwinter!" he exclaimed. "Who could suspect me of that?" "Nobody, Allan, who really knows you. The major knows me. The major is the last man in the world to misunderstand me. All I want him to do is to help me, if he can, to speak about a delicate subject to Miss Gwilt without hurting her feelings. Can anything be simpler between two gentlemen?" Instead of replying, Midwinter, still speaking as constrainedly as ever, asked a question on his side. "Do you mean to tell Major Milroy," he said, "what your intentions really are toward Miss Gwilt?" Allan's manner altered. He hesitated, and looked confused. "I have been thinking of that," he replied, "and I mean to feel my way first, and then tell him or not afterward, as matters turn out." A proceeding so cautious as this was too strikingly inconsistent with Allan's character not to surprise any one who knew him. Midwinter showed his surprise plainly. "You forget that foolish flirtation of mine with Miss Milroy," Allan went on, more and more confusedly. "The major may have noticed it, and may have thought I meant what I didn't mean. It might be rather awkward, mightn't it, to propose to his face for his governess instead of his daughter?" He waited for a word of answer, but none came. Midwinter opened his lips to speak, and suddenly checked himself. Allan, uneasy at his silence, doubly uneasy under certain recollections of the major's daughter which the conversation had called up, rose from the table and shortened the interview a little impatiently. "Come, come," he said, "don't sit there looking unutterable things. Don't make mountains out of molehills. You have such an old head, Midwinter, on those young shoulders of yours. Let's have done with all these pros and cons. Do you mean to tell me in plain words that it won't do to speak to the major?" "I can't take the responsibility, Allan, of telling you that. To be plainer still, I can't feel confident of the soundness of any advice I may give you in our present position toward each other. All I am sure of is that I cannot possibly be wrong in entreating you to do two things." "What are they?" "If you speak to Major Milroy, pray remember the caution I have given you. Pray think of what you say before you say it." "I'll think, never fear. What next?" "Before you take any serious step in this matter, write and tell Mr. Brock. Will you promise me to do that?" "With all my heart. Anything more?" "Nothing more. I have said my last words." Allan led the way to the door. "Come into my room," he said, "and I'll give you a cigar. The servants will be in here directly to clear away, and I want to go on talking about Miss Gwilt." "Don't wait for me," said Midwinter. "I'll follow you in a minute or two." He remained seated until Allan had closed the door, then rose, and took from a corner of the room, where it lay hidden behind one of the curtains, a knapsack ready packed for traveling. As he stood at the window thinking, with the knapsack in his hand, a strangely old, careworn look stole over his face. He seemed to lose the last of his youth in an instant. What the woman's quicker insight had discovered days since, the man's slower perception had only realized in the past night. The pang that had wrung him when he heard Allan's avowal had set the truth self-revealed before Midwinter for the first time. He had been conscious of looking at Miss Gwilt with new eyes and a new mind, on the next occasion when they met after the memorable interview in Major Milroy's garden. But he had never until now known the passion that she had roused in him for what it really was. Knowing it at last, feeling it consciously in full possession of him, he had the courage which no man with a happier experience of life would have possessed, the courage to recall what Allan had confided to him, and to look resolutely at the future through his own grateful remembrances of the past. Steadfastly, through the sleepless hours of the night, he had bent his mind to the conviction that he must conquer the passion which had taken possession of him for Allan's sake, and that the one way to conquer it was to go. No after-doubt as to the sacrifice had troubled him when morning came, and no after-doubt troubled him now. The one question that kept him hesitating was the question of leaving Thorpe Ambrose. Though Mr. Brock's letter relieved him from all necessity of keeping watch in Norfolk for a woman who was known to be in Somersetshire, though the duties of the steward's office were duties which might be safely left in Mr. Bashwood's tried and trustworthy hands, still, admitting these considerations, his mind was not easy at the thought of leaving Allan, at a time when a crisis was approaching in Allan's life. He slung the knapsack loosely over his shoulder, and put the question to his conscience for the last time. Can you trust yourself to see her, day by day as you must see her? Can you trust yourself to hear him talk of her, hour by hour, as you must hear him, if you stay in this house? Again the answer came, as it had come all through the night. Again his heart warned him, in the very interests of the friendship that he held sacred, to go while the time was his own, to go before the woman who had possessed herself of his love had possessed herself of his power of self-sacrifice and his sense of gratitude as well. He looked round the room mechanically before he turned to leave it. Every remembrance of the conversation that had just taken place between Allan and himself pointed to the same conclusion, and warned him, as his own conscience had warned him, to go. Had he honestly mentioned any one of the objections which he, or any man, must have seen to Allan's attachment? Had he, as his knowledge of his friend's facile character bound him to do, warned Allan to distrust his own hasty impulses, and to test himself by time and absence before he made sure that the happiness of his whole life was bound up in Miss Gwilt? No. The bare doubt whether, in speaking of these things, he could feel that he was speaking disinterestedly, had closed his lips, and would close his lips for the future, till the time for speaking had gone by. Was the right man to restrain Allan the man who would have given the world, if he had it, to stand in Allan's place? There was but one plain course of action that an honest man and a grateful man could follow in the position in which he stood. Far removed from all chance of seeing her, and from all chance of hearing of her, alone with his own faithful recollection of what he owed to his friend, he might hope to fight it down, as he had fought down the tears in his childhood under his gypsy master's stick, as he had fought down the misery of his lonely youth-time in the country bookseller's shop. "I must go," he said, as he turned wearily from the window, "before she comes to the house again. I must go before another hour is over my head." With that resolution he left the room, and, in leaving it, took the irrevocable step from present to future. The rain was still falling. The sullen sky all round the horizon still lowered watery and dark, when Midwinter, equipped for traveling, appeared in Allan's room. "Good heavens!" cried Allan, pointing to the knapsack. "What does that mean?" "Nothing very extraordinary," said Midwinter. "It only means good bye." "Good bye!" repeated Allan, starting to his feet in astonishment. Midwinter put him back gently into his chair, and drew a seat near to it for himself. "When you noticed that I looked ill this morning," he said, "I told you that I had been thinking of a way to recover my health, and that I meant to speak to you about it later in the day. That latter time has come. I have been out of sorts, as the phrase is, for some time past. You have remarked it yourself, Allan, more than once; and, with your usual kindness, you have allowed it to excuse many things in my conduct which would have been otherwise unpardonable, even in your friendly eyes." "My dear fellow," interposed Allan, "you don't mean to say you are going out on a walking tour in this pouring rain?" "Never mind the rain," rejoined Midwinter. "The rain and I are old friends. You know something, Allan, of the life I led before you met with me. From the time when I was a child, I have been used to hardship and exposure. Night and day, sometimes for months together, I never had my head under a roof. For years and years, the life of a wild animal, perhaps I ought to say the life of a savage, was the life I led while you were at home and happy. I have the leaven of the vagabond animal or the vagabond man, I hardly know which, in me still. Does it distress you to hear me talk of myself in this way? I won't distress you. I will only say that the comfort and the luxury of our life here are, at times, I think, a little too much for a man to whom comforts and luxuries come as strange things. I want nothing to put me right again but more air and exercise, fewer good breakfasts and dinner, my dear friend, than I get here. Let me go back to some of the hardships which this comfortable house is expressly made to shut out. Let me meet the wind and weather as I used to meet them when I was a boy. Let me feel weary again for a little while, without a carriage near to pick me up, and hungry when the night falls, with miles of walking between my supper and me. Give me a week or two away, Allan, up northward, on foot, to the Yorkshire moors, and I promise to return to Thorpe Ambrose, better company for you and for your friends. I shall be back before you have time to miss me. Mr. Bashwood will take care of the business in the office. It is only for a fortnight, and it is for my own good. Let me go." "I don't like it," said Allan. "I don't like your leaving me in this sudden manner. There's something so strange and dreary about it. Why not try riding if you want more exercise? All the horses in the stables are at your disposal. At all events, you can't possibly go to-day. Look at the rain." Midwinter looked toward the window, and gently shook his head. "I thought nothing of the rain," he said, "when I was a mere child, getting my living with the dancing dogs. Why should I think anything of it now? My getting wet and your getting wet, Allan, are two very different things. When I was a fisherman's boy in the Hebrides, I hadn't a dry thread on me for weeks together." "But you're not in the Hebrides now," persisted Allan, "and I expect our friends from the cottage to-morrow evening. You can't start till after to-morrow. Miss Gwilt is going to give us some more music, and you know you like Miss Gwilt's playing." Midwinter turned aside to buckle the straps of his knapsack. "Give me another chance of hearing Miss Gwilt when I come back," he said, with his head down and his fingers busy at the straps. "You have one fault, my dear fellow, and it grows on you," remonstrated Allan. "When you have once taken a thing into your head, you're the most obstinate man alive. There's no persuading you to listen to reason. If you will go," added Allan, suddenly rising, as Midwinter took up his hat and his stick in silence, "I have half a mind to go with you, and try a little roughing it too." "Go with me?" repeated Midwinter, with a momentary bitterness in his tone, "and leave Miss Gwilt?" Allan sat down again, and admitted the force of the objection in significant silence. Without a word more on his side, Midwinter held out his hand to take leave. They were both deeply moved, and each was anxious to hide his agitation from the other. Allan took the last refuge which his friend's firmness left to him. He tried to lighten the farewell moment by a joke. "I'll tell you what," he said. "I begin to doubt if you're quite cured yet of your belief in the dream. I suspect you're running away from me, after all." Midwinter looked at him, uncertain whether he was in jest or earnest. "What do you mean?" he asked. "What did you tell me," retorted Allan, "when you took me in here the other day and made a clean breast of it? What did you say about this room, and the second vision of the dream? By Jupiter!" he exclaimed, starting to his feet once more, "now I look again, here is the second vision! There's the rain pattering against the window, there's the lawn and the garden outside, here am I where I stood in the dream, and there are you where the shadow stood. The whole scene complete, out of doors and in, and I've discovered it this time." A moment's life stirred again in the dead remains of Midwinter's superstition. His color changed, and he eagerly, almost fiercely, disputed Allan's conclusion. "No," he said, pointing to the little marble figure on the bracket, "the scene is not complete. You have forgotten something, as usual. The dream is wrong this time, thank God, utterly wrong. In the vision you saw, the statue was lying in fragments on the floor, and you were stooping over them with a troubled and an angry mind. There stands the statue safe and sound, and you haven't the vestige of an angry feeling in your mind, have you?" He seized Allan impulsively by the hand. At the same moment the consciousness came to him that he was speaking and acting as earnestly as if he still believed in the dream. The color rushed back over his face, and he turned away in confused silence. "What did I tell you?" said Allan, laughing, a little uneasily. "That night on the wreck is hanging on your mind as heavily as ever." "Nothing hangs heavy on me," retorted Midwinter, with a certain outburst of impatience, "but the knapsack on my back, and the time I'm wasting here. I'll go out, and see if it's likely to clear up." "You'll come back?" interposed Allan. Midwinter opened the French window, and stepped out into the garden. "Yes," he said, answering with all his former gentleness of manner, "I'll come back in a fortnight. Good by, Allan, and good luck with Miss Gwilt." He pushed the window to, and was away across the garden before his friend could open it again and follow him. Allan rose, and took one step into the garden, then checked himself at the window, and returned to his chair. He knew Midwinter well enough to feel the total uselessness of attempting to follow him or to call him back. He was gone, and for 2 weeks to come there was no hope of seeing him again. An hour or more passed, the rain still fell, and the sky still threatened. A heavier and heavier sense of loneliness and despondency, the sense of all others which his previous life had least fitted him to understand and endure, possessed itself of Allan's mind. In sheer horror of his own uninhabitably solitary house, he rang for his hat and umbrella, and resolved to take refuge in the major's cottage. "I might have gone a little way with him," thought Allan, his mind still running on Midwinter as he put on his hat. I should like to have seen the dear old fellow fairly started on his journey. He took his umbrella. If he had noticed the face of the servant who gave it to him, he might possibly have asked some questions, and might have heard some news to interest him in his present frame of mind. As it was, he went out without looking at the man, and without suspecting that his servants knew more of Midwinter's last moments at Thorpe Ambrose than he knew himself. Not 10 minutes since, the grocer and butcher had called in to receive payment of their bills, and the grocer and the butcher had seen how Midwinter started on his journey. The grocer had met him first, not far from the house, stopping on his way, in the pouring rain, to speak to a little ragged imp of a boy, the pest of the neighborhood. The boy's customary impudence had broken out even more unrestrainedly than usual at the sight of the gentleman's knapsack. And what had the gentleman done in return? He had stopped and looked distressed, and had put his 2 hands gently on the boy's shoulders. The grocer's own eyes had seen that, and the grocer's own ears had heard him say, "Poor little chap! I know how the wind gnaws and the rain wets through a ragged jacket, better than most people who have got a good coat on their backs." And with those words he had put his hand in his pocket, and had rewarded the boy's impudence with a present of a shilling. "Wrong hereabouts," said the grocer, touching his forehead. "That's my opinion of Mr. Armadale's friend." The butcher had seen him further on in the journey, at the other end of the town. He had stopped, again in the pouring rain, and this time to look at nothing more remarkable than a half-starved cur, shivering on a doorstep. "I had my eye on him," said the butcher, "and what do you think he did? He crossed the road over to my shop, and bought a bit of meat fit for a Christian. Very well. He says good morning, and crosses back again, and, on the word of a man, down he goes on his knees on the wet doorstep, and out he takes his knife, and cuts up the meat, and gives it to the dog. Meat, I tell you again, fit for a Christian. I'm not a hard man, ma'am," concluded the butcher, addressing the cook, "but meat's meat, and it will serve your master's friend right if he lives to want it." With those old unforgotten sympathies of the old unforgotten time to keep him company on his lonely road, he had left the town behind him, and had been lost to view in the misty rain. The grocer and the butcher had seen the last of him, and had judged a great nature, as all natures are judged from the grocer and the butcher point of view. The end of the second book. End of chapter. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Book the Third, Chapter 1 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book the Third, 1. Mrs. Milroy. 2 days after Midwinter's departure from Thorpe Ambrose, Mrs. Milroy, having completed her morning toilet, and having dismissed her nurse, rang the bell again 5 minutes afterward, and on the woman's reappearance asked impatiently if the post had come in. "Post?" echoed the nurse. "Haven't you got your watch? Don't you know that it's a good half-hour too soon to ask for your letters?" She spoke with the confident insolence of a servant long accustomed to presume on her mistress's weakness and her mistress's necessities. Mrs. Milroy, on her side, appeared to be well used to her nurse's manner. She gave her orders composedly, without noticing it. "When the postman does come," she said, "see him yourself. I am expecting a letter which I ought to have had 2 days since. I don't understand it. I am beginning to suspect the servants." The nurse smiled contemptuously. "Whom will you suspect next?" she asked. "There, don't put yourself out. I'll answer the gate bell this morning, and we'll see if I can bring you a letter when the postman comes." Saying those words with the tone and manner of a woman who is quieting a fractious child, the nurse, without waiting to be dismissed, left the room. Mrs. Milroy turned slowly and wearily on her bed, when she was left by herself again, and let the light from the window fall on her face. It was the face of a woman who had once been handsome, and who was still, so far as years went, in the prime of her life. Long continued suffering of body and long continued irritation of mind had worn her away, in the roughly expressive popular phrase, to skin and bone. The utter wreck of her beauty was made a wreck horrible to behold by her desperate efforts to conceal the sight of it from her own eyes, from the eyes of her husband and her child, from the eyes even of the doctor who attended her, and whose business it was to penetrate to the truth. Her head, from which the greater part of the hair had fallen off, would have been less shocking to see than the hideously youthful wig by which she tried to hide the loss. No deterioration of her complexion, no wrinkling of her skin, could have been so dreadful to look at as the rouge that lay thick on her cheeks, and the white enamel plastered on her forehead. The delicate lace, and the bright trimming on her dressing gown, the ribbons in her cap, and the rings on her bony fingers, all intended to draw the eye away from the change that had passed over her, directed the eye to it, on the contrary, emphasized it, made it by sheer force of contrast more hopeless and more horrible than it really was. An illustrated book of the fashions, in which women were represented exhibiting their finery by means of the free use of their limbs, lay on the bed, from which she had not moved for years without being lifted by her nurse. A hand glass was placed with the book, so that she could reach it easily. She took up the glass after her attendant had left the room, and looked at her face with an unblushing interest and attention which she would have been ashamed of herself at the age of 18. "Older and older, and thinner," she said. "The major will soon be a free man. But I'll have that red-haired hussy out of the house first." She dropped the looking-glass on the counterpane, and clinched the hand that held it. Her eyes suddenly riveted themselves on the little crayon portrait of her husband, hanging on the opposite wall. They looked at the likeness with the hard and cruel brightness of the eyes of a bird of prey. "Red is your taste in your old age, is it?" she said to the portrait. "Red hair and a scrofulous complexion, and a padded figure, a ballet girl's walk, and a pickpocket's light fingers. Miss Gwilt! Miss, with those eyes and that walk!" She turned her head suddenly on the pillow, and burst into a harsh, jeering laugh. "Miss!" she repeated over and over again, with the venomously pointed emphasis of the most merciless of all human forms of contempt, the contempt of one woman for another. The age we live in is an age which finds no human creature inexcusable. Is there an excuse for Mrs. Milroy? Let the story of her life answer the question. She had married the major at an unusually early age, and, in marrying him, had taken a man for her husband who was old enough to be her father, a man who, at that time, had the reputation, and not unjustly, of having made the freest use of his social gifts and his advantages of personal appearance in the society of women. Indifferently educated, and below her husband in station, she had begun by accepting his addresses under the influence of her own flattered vanity, and had ended by feeling the fascination which Major Milroy had exercised over women infinitely her mental superiors in his earlier life. He had been touched, on his side, by her devotion, and had felt, in his turn, the attraction of her beauty, her freshness, and her youth. Up to the time when their little daughter and only child had reached the age of 8 years, their married life had been an unusually happy one. At that period the double misfortune fell on the household of the failure of the wife's health, and the almost total loss of the husband's fortune; and from that moment the domestic happiness of the married pair was virtually at an end. Having reached the age when men in general are readier, under the pressure of calamity, to resign themselves than to resist, the major had secured the little relics of his property, had retired into the country, and had patiently taken refuge in his mechanical pursuits. A woman nearer to him in age, or a woman with a better training and more patience of disposition than his wife possessed, would have understood the major's conduct, and have found consolation in the major's submission. Mrs. Milroy found consolation in nothing. Neither nature nor training helped her to meet resignedly the cruel calamity which had struck at her in the bloom of womanhood and the prime of beauty. The curse of incurable sickness blighted her at once and for life. Suffering can, and does, develop the latent evil that there is in humanity as well as the latent good. The good that was in Mrs. Milroy's nature shrank up under that subtly deteriorating influence in which the evil grew and flourished. Month by month, as she became the weaker woman physically, she became the worse woman morally. All that was mean, cruel, and false in her expanded in steady proportion to the contraction of all that had once been generous, gentle, and true. Old suspicions of her husband's readiness to relapse into the irregularities of his bachelor life, which, in her healthier days of mind and body, she had openly confessed to him, which she had always, sooner or later, seen to be suspicions that he had not deserved, came back, now that sickness had divorced her from him, in the form of that baser conjugal distrust which keeps itself cunningly secret, which gathers together its inflammatory particles atom by atom into a heap, and sets the slowly burning frenzy of jealousy alight in the mind. No proof of her husband's blameless and patient life that could now be shown to Mrs. Milroy, no appeal that could be made to her respect for herself or for her child growing up to womanhood, availed to dissipate the terrible delusion born of her hopeless illness and growing steadily with its growth. Like all other madness, it had its ebb and flow, its time of spasmodic outburst, and its time of deceitful repose, but, active or passive, it was always in her. It had injured innocent servants and insulted blameless strangers. It had brought the first tears of shame and sorrow into her daughter's eyes, and had set the deepest line that scored it in her husband's face. It had made the secret misery of the little household for years, and it was now to pass beyond the family limits, and to influence coming events at Thorpe Ambrose, in which the future interests of Allan and Allan's friend were vitally concerned. A moment's glance at the posture of domestic affairs in the cottage, prior to the engagement of the new governess, is necessary to the due appreciation of the serious consequences that followed Miss Gwilt's appearance on the scene. On the marriage of the governess who had lived in his service for many years, a woman of an age and an appearance to set even Mrs. Milroy's jealousy at defiance, the major had considered the question of sending his daughter away from home far more seriously than his wife supposed. He was conscious that scenes took place in the house at which no young girl should be present, but he felt an invincible reluctance to apply the one efficient remedy, the keeping his daughter away from home in school time and holiday time alike. The struggle thus raised in his mind once set at rest by the resolution to advertise for a new governess, Major Milroy's natural tendency to avoid trouble rather than to meet it had declared itself in its customary manner. He had closed his eyes again on his own anxieties as quietly as usual, and had gone back, as he had gone back on hundreds of previous occasions, to the consoling society of his old friend the clock. It was far otherwise with the major's wife. The chance which her husband had entirely overlooked, that the new governess who was to come might be a younger and a more attractive woman than the old governess who had gone, was the first chance that presented itself as possible to Mrs. Milroy's mind. She had said nothing. Secretly waiting, and secretly nursing her inveterate distrust, she had encouraged her husband and her daughter to leave her on the occasion of the picnic, with the express purpose of making an opportunity for seeing the new governess alone. The governess had shown herself, and the smoldering fire of Mrs. Milroy's jealousy had burst into flame in the moment when she and the handsome stranger first set eyes on each other. The interview over, Mrs. Milroy's suspicions fastened at once and immovably on her husband's mother. She was well aware that there was no one else in London on whom the major could depend to make the necessary inquiries. She was well aware that Miss Gwilt had applied for the situation, in the first instance, as a stranger answering an advertisement published in a newspaper. Yet, knowing this, she had obstinately closed her eyes, with the blind frenzy of the blindest of all the passions, to the facts straight before her, and, looking back to the last of many quarrels between them which had ended in separating the elder lady and herself, had seized on the conclusion that Miss Gwilt's engagement was due to her mother-in-law's vindictive enjoyment of making mischief in her household. The inference which the very servants themselves, witnesses of the family scandal, had correctly drawn, that the major's mother, in securing the services of a well-recommended governess for her son, had thought it no part of her duty to consider that governess's looks in the purely fanciful interests of the major's wife, was an inference which it was simply impossible to convey into Mrs. Milroy's mind. Miss Gwilt had barely closed the sick-room door when the whispered words hissed out of Mrs. Milroy's lips, "Before another week is over, you had, my lady, you go." From that moment, through the wakeful night and the weary day, the one object of the bedridden woman's life was to procure the new governess's dismissal from the house. The assistance of the nurse, in the capacity of spy, was secured, as Mrs. Milroy had been accustomed to secure other extra services which her attendant was not bound to render her, by a present of a dress from the mistress's wardrobe. One after another articles of wearing apparel which were now useless to Mrs. Milroy had ministered in this way to feed the nurse's greed, the insatiable greed of an ugly woman for fine clothes. Bribed with the smartest dress she had secured yet, the household spy took her secret orders, and applied herself with a vile enjoyment of it to her secret work. The days passed, the work went on, but nothing had come of it. Mistress and servant had a woman to deal with who was a match for both of them. Repeated intrusions on the major, when the governess happened to be in the same room with him, failed to discover the slightest impropriety of word, look, or action on either side. Stealthy watching and listening at the governess's bedroom door detected that she kept a light in her room at late hours of the night, and that she groaned and ground her teeth in her sleep, and detected nothing more. Careful superintendence in the daytime proved that she regularly posted her own letters, instead of giving them to the servant, and that on certain occasions, when the occupation of her hours out of lesson time and walking time was left at her own disposal, she had been suddenly missed from the garden, and then caught coming back alone to it from the park. Once, and once only, the nurse had found an opportunity of following her out of the garden, had been detected immediately in the park, and had been asked with the most exasperating politeness if she wished to join Miss Gwilt in a walk. Small circumstances of this kind, which were sufficiently suspicious to the mind of a jealous woman, were discovered in abundance; but circumstances on which to found a valid ground of complaint that might be laid before the major proved to be utterly wanting. Day followed day, and Miss Gwilt remained persistently correct in her conduct, and persistently irreproachable in her relations toward her employer and her pupil. Foiled in this direction, Mrs. Milroy tried next to find an assailable place in the statement which the governess's reference had made on the subject of the governess's character. Obtaining from the major the minutely careful report which his mother had addressed to him on this topic, Mrs. Milroy read and re-read it, and failed to find the weak point of which she was in search in any part of the letter. All the customary questions on such occasions had been asked, and all had been scrupulously and plainly answered. The one sole opening for an attack which it was possible to discover was an opening which showed itself, after more practical matters had been all disposed of, in the closing sentences of the letter. I was so struck, the passage ran, by the grace and distinction of Miss Gwilt's manners, that I took an opportunity, when she was out of the room, of asking how she first came to be governess. In the usual way, I was told. A sad family misfortune, in which she behaved nobly. She is a very sensitive person, and shrinks from speaking of it among strangers, a natural reluctance which I have always felt it a matter of delicacy to respect. Hearing this, of course, I felt the same delicacy on my side. It was no part of my duty to intrude on the poor thing's private sorrows. My only business was to do what I have now done, to make sure that I was engaging a capable and respectable governess to instruct my grandchild. After careful consideration of these lines, Mrs. Milroy, having a strong desire to find circumstances suspicious, found them suspicious accordingly. She determined to sift the mystery of Miss Gwilt's family misfortunes to the bottom, on the chance of extracting from it something useful to her purpose. There were two ways of doing this. She might begin by questioning the governess herself, or she might begin by questioning the governess's reference. Experience of Miss Gwilt's quickness of resource in dealing with awkward questions at their introductory interview decided her on taking the latter course. "I'll get the particulars from the reference first," thought Mrs. Milroy, "and then question the creature herself, and see if the two stories agree." The letter of inquiry was short and scrupulously to the point. Mrs. Milroy began by informing her correspondent that the state of her health necessitated leaving her daughter entirely under the governess's influence and control. On that account she was more anxious than most mothers to be thoroughly informed in every respect about the person to whom she confided the entire charge of an only child; and feeling this anxiety, she might perhaps be excused for putting what might be thought, after the excellent character Miss Gwilt had received, a somewhat unnecessary question. With that preface, Mrs. Milroy came to the point, and requested to be informed of the circumstances which had obliged Miss Gwilt to go out as a governess. The letter, expressed in these terms, was posted the same day. On the morning when the answer was due, no answer appeared. The next morning arrived, and still there was no reply. When the third morning came, Mrs. Milroy's impatience had broken loose from all restraint. She had rung for the nurse in the manner which has been already recorded, and had ordered the woman to be in waiting to receive the letters of the morning with her own hands. In this position matters now stood, and in these domestic circumstances the new series of events at Thorpe Ambrose took their rise. Mrs. Milroy had just looked at her watch, and had just put her hand once more to the bell-pull, when the door opened and the nurse entered the room. "Has the postman come?" asked Mrs. Milroy. The nurse laid a letter on the bed without answering, and waited, with unconcealed curiosity, to watch the effect which it produced on her mistress. Mrs. Milroy tore open the envelope the instant it was in her hand. A printed paper appeared, which she threw aside, surrounding a letter, which she looked at, in her own handwriting. She snatched up the printed paper. It was the customary post-office circular, informing her that her letter had been duly presented at the right address, and that the person whom she had written to was not to be found. "Something wrong?" asked the nurse, detecting a change in her mistress's face. The question passed unheeded. Mrs. Milroy's writing desk was on the table at the bedside. She took from it the letter which the major's mother had written to her son, and turned to the page containing the name and address of Miss Gwilt's reference. "Mrs. Mandeville, 18 Kingstown Crescent, Bayswater," she read eagerly to herself, and then looked at the address on her own returned letter. No error had been committed; the directions were identically the same. "Something wrong?" reiterated the nurse, advancing a step nearer to the bed. "Thank God, yes!" cried Mrs. Milroy, with a sudden outburst of exultation. She tossed the post-office circular to the nurse, and beat her bony hands on the bedclothes in an ecstasy of anticipated triumph. "Miss Gwilt's an impostor! Miss Gwilt's an impostor! If I die for it, Rachel, I'll be carried to the window to see the police take her away." "It's one thing to say she's an impostor behind her back, and another thing to prove it to her face," remarked the nurse. She put her hand as she spoke into her apron pocket, and, with a significant look at her mistress, silently produced a second letter. "For me?" asked Mrs. Milroy. "No," said the nurse, "for Miss Gwilt." The two women eyed each other, and understood each other without another word. "Where is she?" said Mrs. Milroy. The nurse pointed in the direction of the park. "Out again, for another walk before breakfast, by herself." Mrs. Milroy beckoned to the nurse to stoop close over her. "Can you open it, Rachel?" she whispered. Rachel nodded. "Can you close it again so that nobody would know?" "Can you spare the scarf that matches your pearl gray dress?" asked Rachel. "Take it," said Mrs. Milroy, impatiently. The nurse opened the wardrobe in silence, took the scarf in silence, and left the room in silence. In less than 5 minutes she came back with the envelope of Miss Gwilt's letter open in her hand. "Thank you, ma'am, for the scarf," said Rachel, putting the open letter composedly on the counterpane of the bed. Mrs. Milroy looked at the envelope. It had been closed as usual by means of adhesive gum, which had been made to give way by the application of steam. As Mrs. Milroy took out the letter, her hand trembled violently, and the white enamel parted into cracks over the wrinkles on her forehead. Rachel withdrew to the window to keep watch on the park. "Don't hurry," she said. "No signs of her yet." Mrs. Milroy still paused, keeping the all-important morsel of paper folded in her hand. She could have taken Miss Gwilt's life, but she hesitated at reading Miss Gwilt's letter. "Are you troubled with scruples?" asked the nurse, with a sneer. "Consider it a duty you owe to your daughter." "You wretch!" said Mrs. Milroy. With that expression of opinion, she opened the letter. It was evidently written in great haste, was undated, and was signed in initials only. Thus it ran: "Diana Street. My dear Lydia, the cab is waiting at the door, and I have only a moment to tell you that I am obliged to leave London, on business, for 3 or 4 days, or a week at longest. My letters will be forwarded if you write. I got yours yesterday, and I agree with you that it is very important to put him off the awkward subject of yourself and your family as long as you safely can. The better you know him, the better you will be able to make up the sort of story that will do. Once told, you will have to stick to it, and, having to stick to it, beware of making it complicated, and beware of making it in a hurry. I will write again about this, and give you my own ideas. In the meantime, don't risk meeting him too often in the park. Yours, M.O." "Well?" asked the nurse, returning to the bedside. "Have you done with it?" "Meeting him in the park," repeated Mrs. Milroy, with her eyes still fastened on the letter. "Him! Rachel, where is the major?" "In his own room." "I don't believe it!" "Have your own way. I want the letter and the envelope." "Can you close it again so that she won't know?" "What I can open I can shut. Anything more?" "Nothing more." Mrs. Milroy was left alone again, to review her plan of attack by the new light that had now been thrown on Miss Gwilt. The information that had been gained by opening the governess's letter pointed plainly to the conclusion that an adventuress had stolen her way into the house by means of a false reference. But having been obtained by an act of treachery which it was impossible to acknowledge, it was not information that could be used either for warning the major or for exposing Miss Gwilt. The one available weapon in Mrs. Milroy's hands was the weapon furnished by her own returned letter, and the one question to decide was how to make the best and speediest use of it. The longer she turned the matter over in her mind, the more hasty and premature seemed the exultation which she had felt at the first sight of the post-office circular. That a lady acting as reference to a governess should have quitted her residence without leaving any trace behind her, and without even mentioning an address to which her letters could be forwarded, was a circumstance in itself sufficiently suspicious to be mentioned to the major. But Mrs. Milroy, however perverted her estimate of her husband might be in some respects, knew enough of his character to be assured that, if she told him what had happened, he would frankly appeal to the governess herself for an explanation. Miss Gwilt's quickness and cunning would, in that case, produce some plausible answer on the spot, which the major's partiality would be only too ready to accept; and she would at the same time, no doubt, place matters in train, by means of the post, for the due arrival of all needful confirmation on the part of her accomplice in London. To keep strict silence for the present, and to institute, without the governess's knowledge, such inquiries as might be necessary to the discovery of undeniable evidence, was plainly the only safe course to take with such a man as the major, and with such a woman as Miss Gwilt. Helpless herself, to whom could Mrs. Milroy commit the difficult and dangerous task of investigation? The nurse, even if she was to be trusted, could not be spared at a day's notice, and could not be sent away without the risk of exciting remark. Was there any other competent and reliable person to employ, either at Thorpe Ambrose or in London? Mrs. Milroy turned from side to side of the bed, searching every corner of her mind for the needful discovery, and searching in vain. "Oh, if I could only lay my hand on some man I could trust!" she thought, despairingly. "If I only knew where to look for somebody to help me!" As the idea passed through her mind, the sound of her daughter's voice startled her from the other side of the door. "May I come in?" asked Neelie. "What do you want?" returned Mrs. Milroy, impatiently. "I have brought up your breakfast, mamma." "My breakfast?" repeated Mrs. Milroy, in surprise. "Why doesn't Rachel bring it up as usual?" She considered a moment, and then called out, sharply, "Come in!" End of chapter. Recording by Nadine Nicole-Boulet.
Book the Third, Chapter 2 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Anthony Petronic. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Neelie entered the room carrying the tray with the tea, the dry toast, and the pat of butter which composed the invalid's invariable breakfast. "What does this mean?" asked Miss Milroy, speaking and looking as she might have spoken and looked if the wrong servant had come into the room. Neelie put the tray down on the bedside table. "I thought I should like to bring you up breakfast, mamma, for once in a way," she replied, "and I asked Rachel to let me." "Come here," said Miss Milroy, "and wish me good morning." Neelie obeyed, and as she stooped to kiss her mother, Mrs. Milroy caught her by the arm and turned her roughly to the light. There were plain signs of disturbance and distress in her daughter's face. A deadly thrill of terror ran through Mrs. Milroy on the instant. She suspected that the opening of the letter had been discovered by Miss Gwilt, and that the nurse was keeping out of the way in consequence. "Let me go, mamma," said Neelie, shrinking under her mother's grasp. "You hurt me." "Tell me why you brought up my breakfast this morning," persisted Miss Milroy. "I have told you, mamma." "You have not. You have made an excuse. I can see it in your face. Come, what is it?" Neelie's resolution gave way before her mother's. She looked aside uneasily at the things in the tray. "I've been vexed," she said, with an effort, "and I didn't want to stop in the breakfast room. I wanted to come up here and speak to you." "Vexed? Who has vexed you? What has happened? Has Miss Gwilt anything to do with it?" Neelie looked round again at her mother in sudden curiosity and alarm. "Mamma," she said, "you read my thoughts. I declare you frightened me. It was Miss Gwilt." Before Mrs. Milroy could say a word more on her side, the door opened and the nurse looked in. "Have you got what you want?" she asked, as composedly as usual. "Miss, there, insisted on taking your tray up this morning. Has she broken anything?" "Go to the window. I want to speak to Rachel," said Mrs. Milroy. As soon as her daughter's back was turned, she beckoned eagerly to the nurse. "Anything wrong?" she asked, in a whisper. "Do you think she suspects us?" The nurse turned away with her hard, sneering smile. "I told you it should be done," she said, "and it has been done. She hasn't the ghost of a suspicion. I waited in the room, and I saw her take up the letter and open it." Mrs. Milroy drew a deep breath of relief. "Thank you," she said, loud enough for her daughter to hear. "I want nothing more." The nurse withdrew, and Neelie came back from the window. Mrs. Milroy took her by the hand, and looked at her more attentively and more kindly than usual. Her daughter interested her that morning, for her daughter had something to say on the subject of Miss Gwilt. "I used to think that you promised to be pretty, child," she said, cautiously resuming the interrupted conversation in the least direct way. "But you don't seem to be keeping your promise. You look out of health and out of spirits. What is the matter with you?" If there had been any sympathy between mother and child, Neelie might have owned the truth. She might have said frankly, "I am looking ill because my life is miserable. I am fond of Mr. Armadale, and Mr. Armadale was once fond of me. We had one little disagreement, only one, in which I was to blame. I wanted to tell him so at the time, and I have wanted to tell him so ever since. And Miss Gwilt stands between us and prevents me. She has made us like strangers. She has altered him, and taken him away from me. He doesn't look at me as he did. He doesn't speak to me as he did. He is never alone with me as he used to be. I can't say a word to him that I long to say, and I can't write to him, for it would look as if I wanted to get him back. It is all over between me and Mr. Armadale, and it is that woman's fault. There is ill blood between Miss Gwilt and me the whole day long. And say what I may, and do what I may, she always gets the better of me, and always puts me in the wrong. Everything I saw at Thorpe Ambrose pleased me. Everything I did at Thorpe Ambrose made me happy, before she came. Nothing pleases me, and nothing makes me happy now." If Neelie had ever been accustomed to ask her mother's advice, and to trust herself to her mother's love, she might have said words as these. As it was, the tears came into her eyes, and she hung her head in silence. "Come," said Mrs. Milroy, beginning to lose patience. "You have something to say to me about Miss Gwilt. What is it?" Neelie forced back her tears, and made an effort to answer. "She aggravates me beyond endurance, mamma. I can't bear her. I shall do something—" Neelie stopped, and stamped her foot angrily on the floor. "I shall throw something at her head if we go on much longer like this. I should have thrown something this morning, if I hadn't left the room. Oh, do speak to papa about it. Do find out some reason for sending her away. I'll go to school. I'll do anything in the world to get rid of Miss Gwilt." To get rid of Miss Gwilt! At those words, at the echo from her daughter's lips of the dominant desire kept secret in her own heart, Mrs. Milroy slowly raised herself in bed. What did it mean? Was the help she wanted coming from the very last of all quarters in which she could have thought for looking for it? "Why do you want to get rid of Miss Gwilt?" she asked. "What have you to complain of?" "Nothing," said Neelie. "That's the aggravation of it. Miss Gwilt won't let me have anything to complain of. She is perfectly detestable. She is driving me mad. And she is the pink of propriety at all the time. I dare say it's wrong, but I don't care. I hate her." Mrs. Milroy's eyes questioned her daughter's face as they had never questioned it yet. There was something under the surface, evidently something which might be of vital importance to her own purpose to discover, which had not risen into view. She went on probing her way deeper and deeper into Neelie's mind, with a warmer and warmer interest in Neelie's secret. "Pour me out a cup of tea," she said, "and don't excite yourself, my dear. Why do you speak to me about this? Why don't you speak to your father?" "I have tried to speak to papa," said Neelie, "but it's no use. He is too good to know what a wretch she is. She is always on her best behavior with him. She is always contriving to be useful to him. I can't make him understand why I dislike Miss Gwilt. I can't make you understand. I only understand myself." She tried to pour out the tea, and in trying upset the cup. "I'll go downstairs again," exclaimed Neelie with a burst of tears. "I'm not fit for anything. I can't even pour a cup of tea." Mrs. Milroy seized her hand and stopped her. Trifling as it was, Neelie's reference to the relations between the Major and Miss Gwilt had roused her mother's ready jealousy. The restraints which Mrs. Milroy had laid on herself thus far vanished in a moment, vanished even in the presence of a girl of 16, and that girl her own child. "Wait here," she said eagerly. You have come to the right place and the right person. Go on abusing Miss Gwilt. I like to hear you. I hate her, too." "You, mamma?" exclaimed Neelie, looking at her mother in astonishment. For a moment Mrs. Milroy hesitated before she said more. Some last left instinct of her married life in its earlier and happy time pleaded hard with her to respect the youth and the sex of her child. But jealousy respects nothing, in the heaven above or on earth beneath, nothing but itself. The slow fire of self-torment, burning night and day in the miserable woman's breast, flashed its deadly light into her eyes, as the next words dropped slowly and venomously from her lips. "If you had had eyes in your head, you would never have gone to your father," she said. "Your father has reasons of his own for hearing nothing that you can say, or that anybody can say, against Miss Gwilt." Many girls at Neelie's age would have failed to see the meaning hidden under those words. It was the daughter's misfortune, in this instance, to have had experience enough of the mother to understand her. Neelie started back from the bedside, with her face in a glow. "Mamma," she said, "you are talking horribly. Papa is the best and dearest and kindest—" "I won't hear it! I won't hear it!" Mrs. Milroy's fierce temper broke out in an instant, broke out all the more violently from her feeling herself, in spite of herself, to have been in the wrong. "You impudent little fool!" she retorted furiously. "Do you think I want you to remind me of what I owe your father? Am I to learn how to speak of your father, and how to think of your father, and how to love and honor your father, from a forward little minx like you? I was finely disappointed, I can tell you, when you were born. I wished for a boy, you impudent little hussy. If you ever find a man who is fool enough to marry you, he will be a lucky man if you only love him half as well, a quarter as well, 100,000th part as well as I loved your father. Ah, you can cry when it's too late. You can come creeping back to beg your mother's pardon after you have insulted her. You little dowdy half-grown creature, I was handsomer than you will ever be when I married your father. I would have gone through fire and water to serve your father. If he had asked me to cut off one of my arms, I would have done it. I would have done it to please him." She turned suddenly with her face to the wall, forgetting her daughter, forgetting her husband, forgetting everything but the torturing remembrance of her lost beauty. "My arms," she repeated to herself faintly. "What arms I had when I was young!" She snatched up the sleeve of her dressing gown furtively with a shudder. "Oh, look at it now! Look at it now!" Neelie fell on her knees at the bedside and hid her face. In sheer despair of finding comfort and help anywhere else, she had cast herself impulsively on her mother's mercy. And this was how it had ended. "Oh, mamma," she pleaded, "you know I didn't mean to offend you. I couldn't help it when you spoke so of my father. Oh, do forgive me." Mrs. Milroy turned again on her pillow, and looked at her daughter vacantly. "Forgive you?" she repeated, with her mind still in the past, groping its way back darkly to the present. "I beg your pardon, mamma. I beg your pardon on my knees. I am so unhappy. I do want a little kindness. Won't you forgive me?" "Wait a little," rejoined Miss Milroy. "Ah," she said, after an interval, "now I know. Forgive you. Yes, I'll forgive you on one condition." She lifted Neelie's head and looked her searchingly in the face. "Tell me why you hate Miss Gwilt. You've a reason of your own for hating her, and you haven't confessed it yet." Neelie's head dropped again. The burning color that was hiding by hiding her face showed itself on her neck. Her mother saw it, and gave her time. "Tell me," reiterated Mrs. Milroy more gently, "why do you hate her?" The answer came reluctantly, a word at a time, in fragments. "Because she is trying—" "Trying what?" "Trying to make somebody who's much what? Much too young for her, marry her?" "Yes, mamma." Breathlessly interested, Mrs. Milroy leaned forward and twined her hand caressingly in her daughter's hair. "Who is it, Neelie?" she asked in a whisper. "You will never say I told you, mamma." "Never. Who is it?" "Mr. Armadale." Mrs. Milroy leaned back on her pillow in dead silence. The plain betrayal of her daughter's first love, by her daughter's own lips, which would have absorbed the whole attention of other mothers, failed to occupy her for a moment. Her jealousy, distorting all things to fit its own conclusions, was busied in distorting what she had just heard. "A blind," she thought, "which has deceived my girl. It doesn't deceive me. Is Miss Gwilt likely to succeed?" she asked aloud. "Does Mr. Armadale show any sort of interest in her?" Neelie looked up at her mother for the first time. The hardest part of the confession was now over. She had revealed the truth about Miss Gwilt, and she had openly mentioned Allan's name. "He shows the most unaccountable interest," she said. "It's impossible to understand. It's downright infatuation. I haven't patience to talk about it." "How do you come to be in Mr. Armadale's secrets?" inquired Mrs. Milroy. "Has he informed you, of all the people in the world, of his interest in Miss Gwilt?" "Me!" exclaimed Neelie, indignantly. "It's quite bad enough that he should have told papa." At the reappearance of the major in the narrative, Mrs. Milroy's interest in the conversation rose to its climax. She raised herself again from the pillow. "Get a chair," she said. "Sit down, child, and tell me all about it. Every word, mind, every word." "I can only tell you, mamma, what papa told me." "When?" "Saturday. I went in with papa's lunch to the workshop, and he said, 'I have just had a visit from Mr. Armadale, and I want to give you a caution while I think of it.' I didn't say anything, mamma. I only waited. Papa went on, and told me that Mr. Armadale had been speaking to him on the subject of Miss Gwilt, and that he had been asking a question about her which nobody in his position had a right to ask. Papa said he had been obliged, good humoredly, to warn Mr. Armadale to be a little more delicate and a little more careful next time. I didn't feel much interested, mamma, and it didn't matter to me what Mr. Armadale said or did. Why should I care about it?" "Never mind yourself," interposed Mrs. Milroy, sharply. "Go on with what your father said. What was he doing when he was talking about Miss Gwilt? How did he look?" "Much as usual, mamma. He was walking up and down the workshop, and I took his arm and walked up and down with him." "I don't care what you were doing," said Mrs. Milroy, more and more irritably. "Did your father tell you what Mr. Armadale's question was, or did he not?" "Yes, mamma. He said Mr. Armadale began by mentioning that he was very much interested in Miss Gwilt, and he then went on to ask whether papa could tell him anything about her family misfortunes." "What?" cried Mrs. Milroy. The word burst from her almost in a scream, and the white enamel on her face cracked in all directions. "Mr. Armadale said that?" she went on, leaning out further and further over the side of the bed. Neelie started up and tried to put her mother back on the pillow. "Mamma!" she exclaimed. "Are you in pain? Are you ill? You frighten me." "Nothing, nothing, nothing," said Mrs. Milroy. She was too violently agitated to make any other than the commonest of excuses. "My nerves are bad this morning. Don't notice it. I'll try the other side of the pillow. Go on, go on. I'm listening, though I'm not looking at you." She turned her face to the wall, and clinched her trembling hands convulsively beneath her bedclothes. "I've got her," she whispered to herself under her breath. "I've got her at last." "I'm afraid I've been talking too much," said Neelie. "I'm afraid I've been stopping here too long. Shall I go downstairs, mamma, and come back later in the day?" "Go on," repeated Miss Milroy, mechanically. "What did your father say next? Anything more about Mr. Armadale?" "Nothing more, except how papa answered him," Neelie replied. "Papa repeated his own words when he told me about it. He said, in the absence of any confidence volunteered by the lady herself, Mr. Armadale, all I know or wish to know, and you must excuse me for saying all anyone else need know or wish to know, is that Miss Gwilt gave me a perfectly satisfactory reference before she entered my house. Severe, mamma, wasn't it? I don't pity him in the least. He richly deserved it. The next thing was papa's caution to me. He told me to check Mr. Armadale's curiosity if he applied to me next. As if he was likely to apply to me, and as if I should listen to him if he did. That's all, mamma. You won't suppose, will you, that I have told you this because I want to hinder Mr. Armadale from marrying Miss Gwilt?" "Let him marry her if he pleases. I don't care," said Neelie, in a voice that faltered a little, and with a face which was hardly composed enough to be in perfect harmony with the declaration of indifference. "All I want is to be relieved from the misery of having Miss Gwilt for my governess. I'd rather go to school. I should like to go to school. My mind's quite changed about all that, only I haven't the heart to tell papa. I don't know what's come to me. I don't seem to have heart enough for anything now. And when papa takes me on his knee in the evening and says, 'Let's have a talk, Neelie,' he makes me cry. Would you mind breaking it to him, mamma, that I've changed my mind and I want to go to school?" The tears rose thickly in her eyes, and she failed to see that her mother never even turned her pillow to look round at her. "Yes, yes," said Miss Milroy, vacantly. "You're a good girl. You shall go to school." The cruel brevity of the reply, and the tone in which it was spoken, told Neelie plainly that her mother's attention had been wandering far away from her, and that it was useless and needless to prolong the interview. She turned aside quietly, without a word of remonstrance, It was nothing new in her experience to find herself shut out from her mother's sympathies. She looked at her eyes in the glass, and pouring out some cold water, bathed her face. Miss Gwilt shan't see I've been crying, thought Neelie, as she went back to the bedside to take her leave. I've tired you out, mamma, she said gently. Let me go now, and let me come back a little later when you've had some rest. Yes, repeated her mother as mechanically as ever. A little later when I've had some rest. Neelie left the room. A minute after the door had closed on her, Mrs. Milroy rang the bell for her nurse. In the face of the narrative she had just heard, in the face of every reasonable estimate of probabilities, she held to her own jealous conclusions as firmly as ever. Mr. Armadale may believe her, and my daughter may believe her, thought the furious woman, but I know the Major, and she can't deceive me. The nurse came in. "Prop me up," said Mrs. Milroy, "and give me my desk. I want to write." "You're excited," replied the nurse. "You're not fit to write." "Give me the desk," reiterated Mrs. Milroy. "Anything more?" asked Rachel, repeating her invariable formula as she placed the desk on the bed. "Yes, come back in half an hour. I shall want you to take a letter to the great house." The nurse's sardonic composure deserted her for once. "Mercy on us!" she exclaimed, with an accent of genuine surprise. "What next? You don't mean to say you're going to write—" "I am going to write to Mr. Armadale," interposed Mrs. Milroy, "and you are going to take the letter to him, and wait for an answer. And, mind this, not a living soul but our two selves must know of it in the house." "Why are you writing to Mr. Armadale?" asked Rachel, "and why is nobody to know of it but our two selves?" "Wait," rejoined Miss Milroy, "and you will see." The nurse's curiosity, being a woman's curiosity, declined to wait. "I'll help you with my eyes open," she said, "but I won't help you blindfolded." "Oh, if I only had the use of my limbs!" groaned Mrs. Milroy. "You wretch, if I could only do without you!" "You have the use of your head," retorted the impenetrable nurse, "and you ought to know better than to trust me by halves at this time of day." It was brutally put, but it was true, doubly true. After the opening of Miss Gwilt's letter, Milroy gave way. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "Tell me and leave me." "I want to know what you are writing to Mr. Armadale about." "About Miss Gwilt." "What has Mr. Armadale to do with you and Miss Gwilt?" Mrs. Milroy held up the letter that had been returned to her by the authorities at the post office. "Stoop," she said. "Miss Gwilt may be listening at the door. I'll whisper." The nurse stooped, with her eye on the door. "You know that the postman went with this letter to Kingsdown Crescent," said Miss Milroy, "and you know that he found Miss Mandeville gone away, nobody could tell where." "Well," whispered Rachel, "what next?" "This next. When Mr. Armadale gets the letter that I'm going to write to him, he will follow the same road as the postman, and we'll see what happens when he knocks at Mrs. Mandeville's door." "How do you get him to the door?" "I tell him to go to Miss Gwilt's reference." "Is he sweet on Miss Gwilt?" "Yes." "Ah," said the nurse, "I see." End of Book the Third, Chapter 2. Recording by Michael Anthony Petronic.
Book 3, Chapter 3 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book 3, Chapter 3. The Brink of Discovery. The morning of the interview between Mrs. Milroy and her daughter at the cottage was a morning of serious reflection for the squire at the great house. Even Allan's easy-tempered nature had not been proof against the disturbing influences exercised on it by the events of the last 3 days. Midwinter's abrupt departure had vexed him, and Major Milroy's reception of his inquiries relating to Miss Gwilt weighed unpleasantly on his mind. Since his visit to the cottage, he had felt impatient and ill at ease, for the first time in his life, with everybody who came near him. Impatient with Pedgift Junior, who had called on the previous evening to announce his departure for London on business the next day, and to place his services at the disposal of his client. Ill at ease with Miss Gwilt, at a secret meeting with her in the park that morning, and ill at ease in his own company, as he now sat moodily smoking in the solitude of his room. "I can't live this sort of life much longer," thought Allan. If nobody will help me to put the awkward question to Miss Gwilt, I must stumble on some way of putting it for myself. What way? The answer to that question was as hard to find as ever. Allan tried to stimulate his sluggish invention by walking up and down the room, and was disturbed by the appearance of the footman at the first turn. "Now then, what is it?" he asked impatiently. "A letter, sir, and the person waits for an answer." Allan looked at the address. It was in a strange handwriting. He opened the letter, and a little note enclosed in it dropped to the ground. The note was directed, still in the strange handwriting, to Mrs. Mandeville, 18 Kingsdown Crescent, Bayswater, favoured by Mr. Armadale. More and more surprised, Allan turned for information to the signature at the end of the letter. It was Anne Milroy. "Anne Milroy," he repeated. "It must be the major's wife. What can she possibly want with me?" By way of discovering what she wanted, Allan did at last what he might more wisely have done at first. He sat down to read the letter. Private. The Cottage, Monday. Dear Sir, the name at the end of these lines will, I fear, recall to you a very rude return made on my part, some time since, for an act of neighbourly kindness on yours. I can only say in excuse that I am a great sufferer, and that, if I was ill-tempered enough, in a moment of irritation under severe pain, to send back your present of fruit, I have regretted doing so ever since. Attribute this letter, if you please, to my desire to make some atonement, and to my wish to be of service to our good friend and landlord, if I possibly can. I have been informed of the question which you addressed to my husband the day before yesterday on the subject of Miss Gwilt. From all I have heard of you, I am quite sure that your anxiety to know more of this charming person than you know now is an anxiety proceeding from the most honourable motives. Believing this, I feel a woman's interest, incurable invalid as I am, in assisting you. If you are desirous of becoming acquainted with Miss Gwilt's family circumstances, without directly appealing to Miss Gwilt herself, it rests with you to make the discovery, and I will tell you how. It so happens that some few days since I wrote privately to Miss Gwilt's reference on this very subject. I had long observed that my governess was singularly reluctant to speak of her family and her friends, and, without attributing her silence to other than perfectly proper motives, I felt it my duty to my daughter to make some inquiry on the subject. The answer that I have received is satisfactory as far as it goes. My correspondent informs me that Miss Gwilt's story is a very sad one, and that her own conduct throughout has been praiseworthy in the extreme. The circumstances, of a domestic nature, as I gather, are all plainly stated in a collection of letters now in the possession of Miss Gwilt's reference. This lady is perfectly willing to let me see the letters, but not possessing copies of them, and being personally responsible for their security, she is reluctant, if it can be avoided, to trust them to the post, and she begs me to wait until she or I. Under these circumstances, it has struck me that you might possibly, with your interest in the matter, be not unwilling to take charge of the papers. If I am wrong in this idea, and if you are not disposed, after what I have told you, to go to the trouble and expense of a journey to London, you have only to burn my letter and enclosure, and to think no more about it. If you decide on becoming my envoy, I gladly provide you with the necessary introduction to Mrs. Mandeville. You have only, on presenting it, to receive the letters in a sealed packet, to send them here on your return to Thorpe Ambrose, and to wait an early communication from me acquainting you with the result. In conclusion, I have only to add that I see no impropriety in your taking, if you feel so inclined, the course that I propose to you. Miss Gwilt's manner of receiving such allusions as I have made to her family circumstances has rendered it unpleasant for me, and would render it quite impossible for you, to seek information in the first instance from herself. I am certainly justified in applying to a reference, and you are certainly not to blame for being the medium of safely transmitting a sealed communication with one lady to another. If I find in that communication family secrets which cannot honourably be mentioned to any third person, I shall of course be obliged to keep you waiting until I have first appealed to Miss Gwilt. If I find nothing recorded but what is to her honour, and what is sure to raise her still higher in your estimation, I am undeniably doing her a service by taking you into my confidence. This is how I look at the matter, but pray don't allow me to influence you. In any case, I have one condition to make, which I am sure you will understand to be indispensable. The most innocent actions are liable, in this wicked world, to the worst possible interpretation. I must therefore request that you will consider this communication as strictly private. I write to you in a confidence which is on no account, until circumstances may, in my opinion, justify the revelation of it, to extend beyond our two selves. Believe me, dear sir, truly yours, Anne Milroy. In this tempting form, the unscrupulous ingenuity of the major's wife had set the trap. Without a moment's hesitation, Allan followed his impulses, as usual, and walked straight into it, writing his answer and pursuing his own reflections simultaneously in a highly characteristic state of mental confusion. By Jupiter, this is kind of Mrs. Milroy. My dear madam, just the thing I wanted at the time when I needed it most. I don't know how to express my sense of your kindness, except by saying that I will go to London and fetch the letters with the greatest pleasure. She shall have a basket of fruit regularly every day, all through the season. I will go at once, dear madam, and be back to-morrow. Ah, nothing like the women for helping one when one is in love. This is just what my poor mother would have done in Mrs. Milroy's place. On my word of honour as a gentleman, I will take the utmost care of the letters, and keep the thing strictly private, as you request. I would have given £500 to anybody who would have put me up to the right way to speak to Miss Gwilt, and here is this blessed woman doing it for nothing. Believe me, my dear madam, gratefully yours, Allan Armadale. Having sent his reply out to Mrs. Milroy's messenger, Allan paused in a momentary perplexity. He had an appointment with Miss Gwilt in the park for the next morning. It was absolutely necessary to let her know that he would be unable to keep it. She had forbidden him to write, and he had no chance that day of seeing her alone. In this difficulty, he determined to let the necessary intimation reach her through the medium of a message to the major, announcing his departure for London on business, and asking if he could be of service to any member of the family. Having thus removed the only obstacle to his freedom of action, Allan consulted the timetable, and found, to his disappointment, that there was a good hour to spare before it would be necessary to drive to the railway station. In his existing frame of mind, he would infinitely have preferred starting for London in a violent hurry. When the time came at last, Allan, on passing the steward's office, drummed at the door, and called through it to Mr. Bashwood, "I'm going to town. Back to-morrow." There was no answer from within, and the servant, interposing, informed his master that Mr. Bashwood, having no business to attend to that day, had locked up the office, and had left some hours since. On reaching the station, the first person whom Allan encountered was Pedgift Junior, going to London on the legal business which he had mentioned on the previous evening at the great house. The necessary explanations exchanged, and it was decided that the two should travel in the same carriage. Allan was glad to have a companion, and Pedgift, enchanted as usual to make himself useful to his client, bustled away to get the tickets and to see to the luggage. Sauntering to and fro on the platform until his faithful follower returned, Allan came suddenly upon no less a person than Mr. Bashwood himself, standing back in a corner with the guard of the train, and putting a letter, accompanied to all appearance by a fee, privately into the man's hand. "Hallo!" cried Allan, in his hearty way. "Something important there, Mr. Bashwood, eh?" If Mr. Bashwood had been caught in the act of committing murder, he could hardly have shown greater alarm than he now testified at Allan's sudden discovery of him. Snatching off his dingy old hat, he bowed bareheaded, in a palsy of nervous trembling from head to foot. "No, sir, no, sir, only a little letter, a little letter, a little letter," said the deputy steward, taking refuge in reiteration, and bowing himself swiftly backward out of his employer's sight. Allan turned carelessly on his heel. "I wish I could take to that fellow," he thought, "but I can't. He's such a sneak. What the deuce was there to tremble about? Does he think I want to pry into his secrets?" Mr. Bashwood's secret on this occasion concerned Allan more nearly than Allan supposed. The letter which he had just placed in charge of the guard was nothing less than a word of warning addressed to Mrs. Oldershaw, and written by Miss Gwilt. "If you can hurry your business," wrote the major's governess, "do so, and come back to London immediately. Things are going wrong here, and Miss Milroy is at the bottom of the mischief. This morning she insisted on taking up her mother's breakfast, always on other occasions taken up by the nurse. They had a long confabulation in private, and half an hour later I saw the nurse slip out with the letter, and take the path that leads to the great house. The sending of the letter has been followed by young Armadale's sudden departure for London, in the face of an appointment which he had with me for to-morrow morning. This looks serious. The girl is evidently bold enough to make a fight of it for the position of Mrs. Armadale of Thorpe Ambrose, and she has found out some way of getting her mother to help her. Don't suppose I am in the least nervous or discouraged, and don't do anything till you hear from me again. Only get back to London, for I may have serious need of your assistance in the course of the next day or two. I send this letter to town, to save a post, by the midday train, in charge of the guard. As you insist on knowing every step I take at Thorpe Ambrose, I may as well tell you that my messenger, for I can't go to the station myself, is that curious old creature whom I mentioned to you in my first letter. Ever since that time he has been perpetually hanging about here for a look at me. I'm not sure whether I frighten him or fascinate him. Perhaps I do both together. All you need care to know is that I can trust him with my trifling errands, and possibly, as time goes on, with something more. L.G. Meanwhile the train had started from the Thorpe Ambrose station, and the squire and his travelling companion were on their way to London. Some men, finding themselves in Allan's company under present circumstances, might have felt curious to know the nature of his business in the metropolis. Young Pedgift's unerring instinct as a man of the world penetrated the secret without the slightest difficulty. "The old story," thought this wary old head, wagging privately on its lusty young shoulders. "There's a woman in the case, as usual. Any other business would have been turned over to me." Perfectly satisfied with this conclusion, Mr. Pedgift the younger proceeded with an eye to his professional interest to make himself agreeable to his client in the capacity of volunteer courier. He seized on the whole administrative business of the journey to London, as he had seized on the whole administrative business of the picnic at the Broads. On reaching the terminus, Allan was ready to go to any hotel that might be recommended. His invaluable solicitor straightway drove him to a hotel at which the Pedgift family had been accustomed to put up for 3 generations. "You don't object to vegetables, sir?" said the cheerful Pedgift, as the cab stopped at a hotel in Covent Garden Market. "Very good. You may leave the rest to my grandfather, my father, and me. I don't know which of the 3 is most beloved and respected in this house. How do you do, William?" Our head waiter, Mr. Armadale. "Is your wife's rheumatism better? And does the little boy get on nicely at school?" "Your master's out, is he? Never mind, you'll do. This, William, is Mr. Armadale of Thorpe Ambrose. I have prevailed on Mr. Armadale to try our house. Have you got the bedroom I wrote for? Very good. Let Mr. Armadale have it instead of me. My grandfather's favourite bedroom, sir, number 57 on the 2nd floor. Pray take it. I can sleep anywhere. Will you have the mattress on the top of the feather bed? You hear, William. Tell Matilda the mattress on the top of the feather bed. How is Matilda? Has she got the toothache as usual? The head chambermaid, Mr. Armadale, and a most extraordinary woman. She will not part with a hollow tooth in her lower jaw. My grandfather says, have it out. My father says, have it out. I say, have it out. And Matilda turns a deaf ear to all 3 of us. Yes, William, yes. If Mr. Armadale approves, this sitting-room will do. About dinner, sir? Shall we say, in that case, 7:30? William, 7:30. Not the least need to order anything, Mr. Armadale. The head waiter has only to give my compliments to the cook, and the best dinner in London will be sent up, punctual to the minute, as a necessary consequence. Say Mr. Pedgift Junior, if you please, William. Otherwise, sir, we might get my grandfather's dinner or my father's dinner, and they might turn out a little too heavy and old-fashioned in their way of feeding for you and me. As to the wine, William, at dinner my champagne, and the sherry that my father thinks nasty. After dinner the claret with the blue seal. The wine my innocent grandfather said wasn't worth 6 pence a bottle. Ha ha! Poor old boy! You will send up the evening papers and the playbills just as usual, and that will do, I think, William, for the present. An invaluable servant, Mr. Armadale. They're all invaluable servants in this house. We may not be fashionable here, sir, but by the Lord Harry, we are snug. A cab? You would like a cab? Don't stir. I've rung the bell twice. That means cab wanted in a hurry. Might I ask, Mr. Armadale, which way your business takes you? Toward Bayswater. Would you mind dropping me in the park? It's a habit of mine, when I'm in London, to air myself among the aristocracy. Yours truly, sir, has an eye for a fine woman and a fine horse, and when he's in Hyde Park he's quite in his native element. Thus the all-accomplished Pedgift ran on, and by these little arts did he recommend himself to the good opinion of his client. When the dinner hour united the travelling companions again in their sitting-room at the hotel, a far less acute observer than young Pedgift must have noticed the marked change that appeared in Allan's manner. He looked vexed and puzzled, and sat drumming with his fingers on the dining-table without uttering a word. "I'm afraid something has happened to annoy you, sir, since we parted company in the park?" said Pedgift Junior. "Excuse the question. I only ask it in case I can be of any use." "Something that I never expected has happened," returned Allan. "I don't know what to make of it. I should like to have your opinion," he added, after a little hesitation. "That is to say, if you will excuse my not entering into any particulars." "Certainly," assented young Pedgift. "Sketch it in outline, sir. The merest hint will do. I wasn't born yesterday." "Oh, these women!" thought the youthful philosopher, in parenthesis. "Well," began Allan, "you know what I said when we got to this hotel. I said I had a place to go in Bayswater." Pedgift mentally checked off the first point. Case in the suburbs, Bayswater. "And a person, that is to say, no, as I said before, a person to inquire after." Pedgift checked off the next point. Person in the case, she-person or he-person? She-person, unquestionably. Well, I went to the house, and when I asked for her, I mean the person, that is to say, the person— Oh, confound it!" cried Allan. "I shall drive myself mad, and you too, if I try to tell my story in this roundabout way. Here it is in 2 words. I went to number 18 Kingsdown Crescent to see a lady named Mandeville, and when I asked for her, the servant said Mrs. Mandeville had gone away, without telling anybody where, and without even leaving an address at which letters could be sent to her. There! It's out at last, and what do you think of it now?" "Tell me first, sir," said the wary Pedgift, "what inquiries you made when you found this lady had vanished." "Inquiries?" repeated Allan. "I was utterly staggered. I didn't say anything. What inquiries ought I to have made?" Pedgift Junior cleared his throat, and crossed his legs in a strictly professional manner. "I have no wish, Mr. Armadale," he began, "to inquire into your business with Mrs. Mandeville." "No," interposed Allan, bluntly. "I hope you won't inquire into that. My business with Mrs. Mandeville must remain a secret." "But," pursued Pedgift, laying down the law with the forefinger of one hand on the outstretched palm of the other, "I may perhaps be allowed to ask generally whether your business with Mrs. Mandeville is of a nature to interest you in tracing her from Kingsdown Crescent to her present address?" "Certainly," said Allan. "I have a very particular reason for wishing to see her." "In that case, sir," returned Pedgift Junior, "there were 2 obvious questions which you ought to have asked. To begin with, namely, on what date Mrs. Mandeville left, and how she left. Having discovered this, you should have ascertained next what domestic circumstances she went away, whether there was a misunderstanding with anybody, say a difficulty about money matters; also whether she went away alone or with somebody else; also whether the house was her own, or whether she only lodged in it; also, in the latter event— "Stop, stop! You're making my head swim," cried Allan. "I don't understand all these ins and outs. I'm not used to this sort of thing." "I've been used to it myself from my childhood upwards, sir," remarked Pedgift, "and if I can be of any assistance, say the word." "You're very kind," returned Allan. "If you could only help me to find Mrs. Mandeville, and if you wouldn't mind leaving the thing afterward entirely in my hands—" "I'll leave it in your hands, sir, with all the pleasure in life," said Pedgift Junior. "And I'll lay 5 to 1," he added, mentally, "when the time comes, you'll leave it in mine. We'll go to Bayswater together, Mr. Armadale, to-morrow morning. In the meantime, here's the soup. The case now before the court is pleasure versus business. I don't know what you say, sir. I say, without a moment's hesitation, verdict for the plaintiff. Let us gather our rosebuds while we may. Excuse my high spirits, Mr. Armadale. Though buried in the country, I was made for a London life. The very air of the metropolis intoxicates me." With that avowal, the irresistible Pedgift placed a chair for his patron, and issued his orders cheerfully to his viceroy, the head waiter. "Iced punch, William, after the soup. I answer for the punch, Mr. Armadale. It's made after a recipe of my great uncle's. He kept a tavern, and founded the fortunes of the family. I don't mind telling you the Pedgifts have had a publican among them. There's no false pride about me. Worth makes the man, as Pope says, and want of it the fellow. The rest is all but leather and prunella. I cultivate poetry as well as music, sir, in my leisure hours. In fact, I'm more or less on familiar terms with the whole of the 9 muses. Ah, here's the punch. The memory of my great uncle, the publican, Mr. Armadale, drunk in solemn silence." Allan tried hard to emulate his companion's gaiety and good humour, but with very indifferent success. His visit to Kingsdown Crescent recurred ominously again and again to his memory all through the dinner, and all through the public amusements to which he and his legal adviser repaired at a later hour of the evening. When Pedgift Junior put out his candle that night, he shook his weary head, and regretfully apostrophized the women for the second time. By 10 o'clock the next morning, the indefatigable Pedgift, was on the scene of action. To Allan's great relief, he proposed making the necessary inquiries at Kingsdown Crescent in his own person, while his patron waited near at hand, in the cab which had brought them from the hotel. After a delay of little more than 5 minutes, he reappeared, in full possession of all attainable particulars. His first proceeding was to request Allan to step out of the cab, and to pay the driver. Next, he politely offered his arm, and led the way round the corner of the Crescent, across a square, and into a by-street, which was rendered exceptionally lively by the presence of the local cab-stand. Here he stopped, and asked jocosely whether Mr. Armadale saw his way now, or whether it would be necessary to test his patience by making an explanation. "See my way?" repeated Allan, in bewilderment. "I see nothing but a cab-stand." Pedgift Junior smiled compassionately, and entered on his explanation. It was a lodging-house at Kingsdown Crescent, he begged to state to begin with. He had insisted on seeing the landlady, a very nice person, with all the remains of having been a fine girl about 50 years ago, quite in Pedgift's style, if he had only been alive at the beginning of the present century, quite in Pedgift's style. But perhaps Mr. Armadale would prefer hearing about Mrs. Mandeville? Unfortunately, there was nothing to tell. There had been no quarrelling, and not a farthing left unpaid. The lodger had gone, and there wasn't an explanatory circumstance to lay hold of anywhere. It was either Mrs. Mandeville's way to vanish, or there was something under the rose, quite undiscoverable so far. Pedgift had got the date on which she left, and the time of day at which she left, and the means by which she left. The means might help to trace her. She had gone away in a cab which the servant had fetched from the nearest stand. The stand was now before their eyes, and the waterman was the first person to apply to, going to the waterman for information, being clearly, if Mr. Armadale would excuse the joke, going to the fountain-head. Treating the subject in this airy manner, and telling Allan that he would be back in a moment, Pedgift Junior sauntered down the street, and beckoned the waterman confidentially into the nearest public-house. In a little while the two reappeared, the waterman taking Pedgift in succession to the first, third, fourth, and sixth of the cabmen whose vehicles were on the stand. The longest conference was held with the sixth man, and it ended in the sudden approach of the sixth cab to the part of the street where Allan was waiting. "Get in, sir," said Pedgift, opening the door. "I've found the man. He remembers the lady, and, though he has forgotten the name of the street, he believes he can find the place he drove her to when he once gets back into the neighborhood. I am charmed to inform you, Mr. Armadale, that we are in luck. So far. I asked the waterman to show me the regular men on the stand, and it turns out that one of the regular men drove Mrs. Mandeville. The waterman vouches for him. He's quite an anomaly, a respectable cabman, drives his own horse, and has never been in any trouble. These are the sort of men, sir, who sustain one's belief in human nature. I've had a look at our friend, and I agree with the waterman. I think we can depend on him." The investigation required some exercise of patience at the outset. It was not till the cab had traversed the distance between Bayswater and Pimlico that the driver began to slacken his pace and look about him. After once or twice retracing its course, the vehicle entered a quiet by-street, ending in a dead wall, with a door in it, and stopped at the last house on the left-hand side, the house next to the wall. "Here it is, gentlemen," said the man, opening the cab-door. Allan and Allan's adviser both got out, and both looked at the house, with the same feeling of instinctive distrust. Buildings have their physiognomy, especially buildings in great cities, and the face of this house was essentially furtive in its expression. The front windows were all shut, and the front blinds were all drawn down. It looked no larger than the other houses in the street, seen in front, but it ran back deceitfully, and gained its greater accommodation by means of its greater depth. It affected to be a shop on the ground floor, but it exhibited absolutely nothing in the space that intervened between the window and an inner row of red curtains, which hid the interior entirely from view. At one side was the shop door, having more red curtains behind the glazed part of it, and bearing a brass plate on the wooden part of it, inscribed with the name of Oldershaw. On the other side was the private door, with the bell marked Professional, and another brass plate, indicating a medical occupant on this side of the house, for the name on it was Dr. Downward. If ever brick and mortar spoke yet, the brick and mortar here said plainly, "We have got our secrets inside, and we mean to keep them." "This can't be the place," said Allan. "There must be some mistake." "You know best, sir," remarked Pedgift Junior, with his sardonic gravity. "You know Mrs. Mandeville's habits." "I!" exclaimed Allan. "You may be surprised to hear it, but Mrs. Mandeville is a total stranger to me." "I'm not in the least surprised to hear it, sir. The landlady at Kingsdown Crescent informed me that Mrs. Mandeville was an old woman. Suppose we inquire," added the impenetrable Pedgift, looking at the red curtains in the shop window, with a strong suspicion that Mrs. Mandeville's granddaughter might possibly be behind them. They tried the shop door first. It was locked. They rang. A lean and yellow young woman, with a tattered French novel in her hand, opened it. "Good morning, miss," said Pedgift. "Is Mrs. Mandeville at home?" The yellow young woman stared at him in astonishment. "No person of that name is known here," she answered, sharply, in a foreign accent. "Perhaps they know her at the private door," suggested Pedgift Junior. "Perhaps they do," said the yellow young woman, and shut the door in his face. "Rather a quick-tempered young person, that, sir," said Pedgift. "I congratulate Mrs. Mandeville on not being acquainted with her." He led the way, as he spoke, to Dr. Downward's side of the premises, and rang the bell. The door was opened this time by a man in a shabby livery. He, too, stared when Mrs. Mandeville's name was mentioned, and he, too, knew of no such person in the house. "Very odd," said Pedgift, appealing to Allan. "What is odd?" asked a softly stepping, softly speaking gentleman in black, suddenly appearing on the threshold of the parlour door. Pedgift Junior politely explained the circumstances, and begged to know whether he had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Downward. The doctor bowed. If the expression may be pardoned, he was one of those carefully constructed physicians in whom the public, especially the female public, implicitly trust. He had the necessary bald head, the necessary double eyeglass, the necessary black clothes, and the necessary blandness of manner, all complete. His voice was soothing, his ways were deliberate, his smile was confidential. What particular branch of his profession Dr. Downward followed was not indicated on his door-plate, but he had utterly mistaken his vocation if he was not a lady's medical man. "Are you quite sure there is no mistake about the name?" asked the doctor, with a strong underlying anxiety in his manner. "I have known very serious inconvenience to arise sometimes from mistakes about names. No? There's really no mistake? In that case, gentlemen, I can only repeat what my servant has already told you. Don't apologize, pray. Good morning." The doctor withdrew, as noiselessly as he had appeared. The man in the shabby livery silently opened the door, and Allan and his companion found themselves in the street again. "Mr. Armadale," said Pedgift, "I don't know how you feel. I feel puzzled." "That's awkward," returned Allan. "I was just going to ask you what we ought to do next." "I don't like the look of the place, the look of the shopwoman, or the look of the doctor," pursued the other. "And yet I can't say I think they are deceiving us. I can't say I think they really know Mrs. Mandeville's name." The impressions of Pedgift Junior seldom misled him, and they had not misled him in this case. The caution which had dictated Mrs. Oldershaw's private removal from Bayswater was the caution which frequently overreaches itself. It had warned her to trust nobody at Pimlico with the secret of the name she had assumed as Miss Gwilt's reference. But it had entirely failed to prepare her for the emergency that had really happened. In a word, Mrs. Oldershaw had provided for everything except for the one unimaginable contingency of an after-inquiry into the character of Miss Gwilt. "We must do something," said Allan. "It seems useless to stop here." Nobody had ever yet caught Pedgift Junior at the end of his resources, and Allan failed to catch him at the end of them now. "I quite agree with you, sir," he said. "We must do something. We'll cross-examine the cabman." The cabman proved to be immovable. Charged with mistaking the place, he pointed to the empty shop window. "I don't know what you may have seen, gentlemen," he remarked, "but there's the only shop window I ever saw with nothing at all inside it. That fixed the place in my mind at the time, and I know it again when I see it." Charged with mistaking the person or the day, or the house at which he had taken the person up, the cabman proved to be still unassailable. The servant who fetched him was marked as a girl well known on the stand. The day was marked as the unluckiest working day he had since the first of the year, and the lady was marked as having had her money ready at the right moment, which not one elderly lady in 100 usually had, and having paid him his fare on demand without disputing it, which not one elderly lady in 100 usually did. "Take my number, gentlemen," concluded the cabman, "and pay me for my time, and what I've said to you, I'll swear to anywhere." Pedgift made a note in his pocket-book of the man's number. Having added to it the name of the street, and the names on the 2 brass plates, he quietly opened the cab door. "We are quite in the dark thus far," he said. "Suppose we grope our way back to the hotel?" He spoke, and looked more seriously than usual. The mere fact of Mrs. Mandeville's having changed her lodging without telling any one where she was going, and without leaving any address at which letters could be forwarded to her, which the jealous malignity of Mrs. Milroy had interpreted as being undeniably suspicious in itself, had produced no great impression on the more impartial judgment of Allan's solicitor. People frequently left their lodgings in a private manner, with perfectly producible reasons for doing so. But the appearance of the place to which the cabman persisted in declaring that he had driven Mrs. Mandeville set the character and proceedings of that mysterious lady before Pedgift Junior in a new light. His personal interest in the inquiry suddenly strengthened, and he began to feel a curiosity to know the real nature of Allan's business, which he had not felt yet. "Our next move, Mr. Armadale, is not a very easy move to see," he said, as they drove back to the hotel. "Do you think you could put me in possession of any further particulars?" Allan hesitated, and Pedgift Junior saw that he had advanced a little too far. "I mustn't force it," he thought. "I must give it time, and let it come of its own accord." "In the absence of any other information, sir," he resumed, "what do you say to my making some inquiry about that queer shop, and about those 2 names on the door-plate? My business in London, when I leave you, is of a professional nature, and I am going into the right quarter for getting information, if it is to be got." "There can't be any harm, I suppose, in making inquiries," replied Allan. He, too, spoke more seriously than usual. He, too, was beginning to feel an all-mastering curiosity to know more. Some vague connection, not to be distinctly realized or traced out, began to establish itself in his mind between the difficulty of approaching Miss Gwilt's family circumstances and the difficulty of approaching Miss Gwilt's reference. "I'll get down and walk, and leave you to go on your business," he said. "I want to consider a little about this, and a walk and a cigar will help me." "My business will be done, sir, between 1 and 2, said Pedgift, when the cab had been stopped, and Allan had got out. "Shall we meet again at 2 o'clock, at the hotel?" Allan nodded, and the cab drove off. End of Book 3, Chapter 3.